Welcome, Professor Chen, Dr. Moyo, and my colleague, Lawrence at the LSE. We are just about a minute into our live stream into this, what I consider the most exciting part of our day, the grand finale here. Nothing seems to be as exciting as when we move into politics, right? And particularly with two amazing thinkers and the most eloquent orator, I think that on China-Africa topics on the global stage. And so we are truly honored to have both gentlemen joining us today. So if we may just to get started, we have been going through this live stream for a whole day. We covered many topics and perhaps most of the topics you would consider very soft. We went from investments to trade, to education, to sustainability, and now we are finally moving into some hardcore, exciting issues here. That is China. Is it a friend or a foe? I remember many years ago as former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott used to say, hey, China is our frenemy. What is a frenemy? Well, Australians are great at coining words. So today, a friend or not a friend, I guess that is the question we're trying to debate here. So joining us today, again, are two really most passionate and eloquent thinkers that we are so honored to have on China and Africa. Professor Stephen Chen, Chair Professor in World Politics and the Foundation Dean of Law and the Social Sciences at SOAS, University of London. I must say, though, Professor Chen, we have been getting a rising number of social media hits from SOAS. So thank you for bringing the web traffic to us, to the LSE. And Dr. Moyo, politician and economist, former Minister of Industry and Zimbabwe. I know you were with us in the morning session, and actually that session happened to get the highest number of comments on our social media so far as well. So indeed, we're just coming to the highlight of the day here, and I'm very honored to have my colleague Lawrence Redford, Managing Director of the China-Africa blog at the LSE, to be my co-moderator here. We have two strong debaters, so it's always safe to have a strong hand next to me. So a quick commercial here. For anyone who's tuning into our live stream now, please search for Professor Stephen Chen and Dr. Knosana Moyo on your social media accounts. Follow them, but at the same time, do search out China-Africa blog at the LSE and follow us as well. I don't think Professor Chen and Dr. Moyo, you two need a moderator really to start a debate. I understand that you debate with each other with the moderator anyhow. So I guess we will sit back and just let you take off, and I will taper down the temperature when it gets too hot, I guess. So why don't we start with both of you? Lawrence was checking with me earlier, say, where do they stand on this issue? I said, I have no idea. So why don't we just give you two the opportunity to tell the world, what do you think about this issue? And maybe because Professor Chen, it's your first time, and since you are so popular with our SOAS audience, why don't we start with you first?
Well, I'm very, very happy to start. And I want to thank you. And I'm very, very impressed that LSE has undertaken this initiative. We regard SOAS and LSE as sister institutions. So it's only natural that our students would want to participate in what you've put together. So thank you for making this available. And Knosana and I have known each other for many years, and we have, in fact, shared platforms before on the China-Africa issue. On the question, China, is it a friend or a foe? Well, I think that China wants to be a friend, but it's been rather clumsy and not always very skillful in its friendship. But it's tried to be a friend for many, many long years. And I think this really emanates as far back as the 1955 Bandung Conference, when the then Chinese Prime Minister, Zhou Enlai, went to Bandung and basically declared that China was going to help the emerging world and do so without conditions, and also do so without interference. Now, to a certain extent, China has lived up to that promise, but it hasn't always understood very well the emerging world. It hasn't fully understood Africa. When I first started going to China some years ago, working on China-Africa issues, negotiating on the side of African delegations, I discovered two things. A, they were astounded that a Chinese person would be negotiating with the Africans. and B, the state of their data, the state of their information was at that stage, we're talking about 15 years ago now, I thought extremely primitive. It wasn't well developed. All of their researchers were towing a party line. In other words, those who were making decisions were getting to hear what they wanted to hear. And that was China was nothing but of benefit to Africa. It's only in more recent days, particularly in my experience with the State Council of the Chinese Prime Minister, you're getting to have what I would regard as nuanced and sophisticated information. But this means that you've had for many, many years Chinese making policy towards Africa that has not been what you and I would regard as fully formed in terms of basic information feeds. And so a lot of clumsiness. And also a lot of residue still from the Cold War, when Africa was seen very, very much as something which had to be gotten on side. The terrible Chinese mistakes in taking military sides in Angola simply because the Russians were taking another side and choosing the side that the Russians weren't on, and then choosing the wrong side was very, very much evidence of a certain kind of naivety. At the same time, they've been very instrumental in helping liberation movements. My famous story when I was assigned to the 1980 Zimbabwe independence elections, liaising at lieutenant colonel level. Not that I was lieutenant colonel, I got a jumped up liaison rank pronto so I could do this. But Mugabe's lieutenant colonels, seeing that I was Chinese, immediately pulled out of their webbing chopsticks, saying, we're going to feed you tonight Chinese style, because we were taught in Tanzania by Chinese instructors who also introduced us to the cuisine. And they had nothing but good words for the help that China gave. In their words, because you people helped us when no one else would. And that kind of legacy has remained, so that there's still an awful lot of Chinese feed into Zimbabwe. China's helped keep Zimbabwe pretty much afloat with a whole range of project-related investments, but still bringing money into the country. Similarly, the controversy around Sudan for so many years, it refused to criticize President Bashir, even while the atrocities of Darfur were underway, until finally they put in a lot of heavyweight intervention. But that's because Sudan was the fourth country in Africa to offer China diplomatic recognition when China was a diplomatic pariah. So the Chinese remember the debts from the old days. However, they can be extremely clumsy in terms of their overtures to Africa. Now, in part, I need to say that very often African delegations and African governments don't negotiate very well. There are some spectacular exceptions to this. I really rate what the Angolans and the Ethiopians are doing. They're negotiating with sophistication and nuance and pushback. Not everyone does that. So it was just released today that Zambia, a country that's very close to my heart, is 66 billion in debt, US billion in debt to China, twice the previous estimate. I'd be surprised if the Zimbabweans were not in debt more than that. And this is a picture of Chinese largesse, which comes with certain forms of conditionality, which one day have to be met. You've got to pay the piper. And notwithstanding the lack of capacity or the lack of will to negotiate on the part of many African governments, what you've got is also, I think, a certain amount of license on the part of not so much the Chinese government these days, but with the permission of the Chinese government, Chinese banks and making available loan finance. And this has got to be something which has given a certain degree of, as it were, moderation and a certain degree of oversight. Certainly what the world can do is to try to enhance African negotiating capacity, but that's quite hard. You've got 55 different countries, remember. That's including Somaliland as a recognized country. So you've got, as it were, a friend or someone who tries to be a friend, who gets it very badly and clumsily wrong from time to time. But the other side of the friendship can sometimes still be naive, not helpless, not just open material for a new colonization. Those are lazy terms, much more sophisticated than that. But everybody's understanding and everybody's capacity to negotiate along very subtle lines on both sides, that needs to be upgraded.
Very interesting indeed. However, Professor Chen, when you mentioned China is clumsy friends, no matter how clumsy, you would still consider China a friend. So, Dr. Moyo, what about your position?
Thank you very much, Shirley. And thanks, Stephen. And yeah, Stephen has already put a context to our constant engagements on this particular issue. And I don't think I need to repeat the factual basis because I think we all probably know what the facts are. What is interesting for me is how we then interpret those facts. And when you put labels like friend or foe, you are almost implying an intention in the actions that you perceive are happening. So, and I suppose my other sort of background comment would be that I rather this is called a discussion rather than a debate, to be honest with you, because debate implies a pro and sort of and against, and I think we are going to have a conversation. My starting point is to acknowledge that for as long as the world at the moment has got the architecture of nation states, a government that is responsible for a country's first responsibility is to its citizens, not to. And we didn't like President Trump when he put it very bluntly, but clumsily, to borrow a word here, but he was just telling us the truth, that everybody does it, but maybe we nuance it, we are soft on how we put it, but he was very blunt and clumsy in just telling us bluntly that he was going to look after American interests first. Americans elected him, he was responsible for that country, and not for any other country. And I think we need to have that as a backdrop. The Chinese government and the Chinese people look after their interests first, and that is their responsibility and their right. So, is there anything that China has done, either historically or at present, where you can say, I see an evil intent behind what they do? I would be challenged to see, but I'm quite open to be pointed in the direction of where that evidence exists, because I don't have it myself. But does it mean that all their interventions are going to help the continent, the African continent? I think the answer is no, as Prof has said already. There's going to be some damage. For me, however, the question that then arises is who is responsible for these outcomes or for allowing these actions to take place in the manner in which they take place in the first place. If China is responsible for China, I know we are using a country against 54, but we understand in the context of this conversation that when we say Africa, it's a collection of many countries. We are averaging out, we understand all of that, and let's not debate the fact that it's a country against 54. So we, on the African side, I think need to have agency. So if China comes and extends what is supposed to be a helping hand, and yes, their knowledge or firstly their intention, we cannot question, or if we question, I would like us to debate that and get the evidence. But if we take it at their word that they want to help, the fact that they may not know how to help means we have got a responsibility to guide them in terms of us being clearer on what we want. If we were clearer on what we want, engaged with them, and pointed out to them that their manner of engagement is not appropriate, and then they resisted and insisted on a predetermined position, then we could have a conversation about, so what is the intention? But I think the problem we have is that there is no evidence from most African countries other than, I didn't realize that Angola is doing it. I know that Ethiopia has been very good at this. Having clarity on what it is they want from a development partner. And in fact, I would broaden this conversation and say it does not matter whether it's China or America or the UK or France or Germany, the same dynamic is going to arise. If we are not capable of having clarity and laying out what our agenda is and what our priorities are and how we want to sequence things, who is responsible? Is it China or is it us? My own humble opinion is that we have to take ownership. And I would like it based on evidence that China has rejected such guidance from an African country. where an African country has had clarity and has put on the table what it is their wishes are, and then China has said, no, we're not going to do it that way. Let's have the evidence. I don't know it. So my inclination is for us to take ownership of this issue in this conversation, to say the blame, if there is going to be any, is on our side, either because of corruption or lack of preparedness, not deploying the best resources we have. Part of, sadly, part of this issue of putting patronage ahead of merit in the teams that we construct to go and engage. Who is to blame? Is it China? I don't think so. So my view is that China is neither an enemy or a foe. An enemy or a friend. China is, I think, available to use its resources to support our intentions, provided we can spell them out clearly enough. That's where I would leave it.
Very interestingly, that's a very utilitarian way of looking at international relations, actually. Her Excellency Ruth Kagia, the Deputy Chief of Staff to the President of Kenya, just did a panel session with us earlier, the session before us. She actually talked about very similar views about this return to realpolitik, and essentially she said a friend in need is a friend indeed, and China is indeed there for Africa. So I guess here is more of a humanitarian question rather than a political science question. That is, if China brings the expertise, China brings the money, China brings the investment in the infrastructure, and then Africa says, well, we need it, so China will welcome you to come in. Well, that's money on the table. But does money build trust or friendship?
But you know what, Shirley, if we don't take ownership of this issue, so I come from a banking background. If you've got a project and you come to me asking for a loan, you have to tell me what you want the money for. I don't just give you money. You have to convince me what you want the money for, because in that interaction, I want to see the viability of what it is you're going to do with the money, so that you can pay me back. Because remember, as a financier, the money most of the time is not mine anyway. I've got a bit of capital on the line, but most of the money is either borrowed from markets or is my depositor's money. And therefore, what is at stake for me, the banker, is that you're going to pay me back. So I need to be convinced that you have to justify. I don't have to tell you I don't come saying, take this money and go away and do whatever you want with it. You have to convince me. You have to come up with a well thought out presentation of what you want to do with the money. And you can't just take the money and waste it and then blame me for having made that money available. Why did you take it? What were you going to do with it?
No, I agree with that, absolutely. Just to extend the case of Zambia that I referred to a little bit earlier, the Minister of Finance of the previous government, Margaret Monakatwe, also had a banking background. I knew her very well, and she was a very, very able banker. But she had no real say in the final political decisions taken by President Lungu, who basically wanted quick fix solutions to a whole range of development problems. So he got a lot of infrastructure, but a huge cost of indebtedness. And the other experience which comes to mind was when I was addressing a private conference of the deputy governors of all the central banks in Africa, everyone involved with managing sovereign wealth funds. And the Namibian director of their sovereign wealth fund ambushed me and said, can you please look at this deal we've just signed with the Chinese for platinum expropriation? And I looked at it, and my face must have turned white. She said, is it that bad? And I said, you've been screwed. And she said, yes, I know that too. But our president, this was in the days before President Geingob, said we had to sign it off for political reasons. So you've got, as it were, a two-level problem. Often there's extremely good expertise, technocratic expertise, at the level just below the highest political level. but you've got political agendas which are not often at the very highest levels well thought out. So there's a real problem here in terms of a match between capacity, which is often there, and political willingness, which is often determined to go ahead in a way which is dangerous for the future, and debt basically accumulates. So trying to sort that out is not just down to a simple rubric that says capacity development. And that, again, I think is reductionist and very, very naive. It's level of capacity, deployment of that, and the interaction between political policy, political driving forces, and the technocratic capacity that is there. Once you've got that marriage right, and that's why I singled out the Ethiopians. I think that, for instance, the minister in the Prime Minister's office in Ethiopia, Akebe Akube, who incidentally is a SOAS PhD, I have to get that plug in there somewhere, has a good relationship with the Prime Minister and with his predecessors, because he was also the mayor of Addis Ababa. When you've got that kind of synergy between skill and political vision, one can moderate the other. And I think that's what's required, not just something simple that says capacity or sort of lack of naivety. It's a more complex picture than that. Africa is developing very rapidly, so these contradictions between political drive and policy technocratic capacity, those contradictions are going to become more and more present in the picture, particularly when you're dealing with complex relationships, and the Chinese relationship is a very complex one.
In fact, Stephen, you are absolutely right.
So it's another compound.
So let me give you an example. I mean, I once asked a Chinese friend why it was that China appeared to have a problem channeling resources to the private sector directly rather than to the public sector. And I got a very interesting answer, and that speaks to part of what Professor Chan has just highlighted. The Chinese have got a certain way of governing themselves. And unsurprisingly, that therefore, their interaction with Africa is based on their own model of how they govern themselves. And we on the African continent are tending to the Western world in terms of how we govern ourselves, i.e., there is a private sector and there is a public sector where the one cannot dictate. It can regulate and make policy and so on, but by and large, the private sector in the Western world does its own thing. Whereas my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, there is a much better alignment from almost like a national agenda perspective between the public and the private sector in China. At least that's what I perceive. And in many ways, almost a hierarchy, not just an alignment, but a hierarchy. And so the answer I got was an interesting one. The answer was that the Chinese make an assumption that at the apex of a society is government, and the government is responsible for looking after the welfare of its citizens. And so if you are wanting to assist a country, what makes sense for the Chinese is that the resources go to the government, and the government has got the know-how at the domestic level where the money should go, where the resources should go, private, public, or whatever. Now, once I got this explanation, it became clear to me that how they were managing this intervention made sense because of their way of operating. So it's up to us to understand where they are coming from. And if our governments are irresponsible in terms of how they then manage the allocation of those resources, it cannot be blamed on the Chinese. They've made the resources available to the highest authority in their opinion, for that authority to then decide how to distribute the resources. So one has to be, again, these nuances of how you negotiate, but starting off with understanding the reference point of the other side. How do they think? Why do they think like that? How do you adjust their thought process to suit your own conditions? It's got to be our responsibility.
So let me say this. I remember many years ago, Condoleezza Rice, the former Secretary of State, she used to say something that really touched me. She said, if China wanted to be the global leader, let China, because unless China becomes one, China doesn't really know the responsibility it takes to be a global leader. And I think very much so when it comes to China-Africa relationships, China talks about win-win. And I think what Professor Chan has referred to, I think China is yet to step up on the soft power understanding of its position to match its economic position in the world today. And so China goes out and talk to African countries about win-win. China is a big power. African countries are relatively smaller powers. If I talk with you, Dr. Moyo, about win-win, do you treat me as a friend? Do you really trust me? Do you trust me, Professor Chen?
You see, my starting point is very simple. I expect you to act on the basis of what you know and what your interests are. And I think that is legitimate. There is nothing wrong with it. I say, from the other side, it is my responsibility to have knowledge of what I want and framework of how I'm going to do it. And in the engagement, just like we've said, Ethiopia has demonstrated this and done it well. All the other African countries, if they are interested, ought to go and engage with Ethiopia and see how come it has worked. This engagement with China has worked in Ethiopia. It's because Ethiopia never made the mistake of saying China is going to come and tell us what to do. Ethiopians have always been clear. We'll go and ask for assistance if it's assistance, or ask for resources where we can get them. But Ethiopia belongs to us. And it is our responsibility to know what to do, how to sequence it, and why we want to do it that way. Then when they explain themselves, if you say, we don't see it the same way, Ethiopians have always been, they say, it's okay, it's your money, and therefore it's your right to say so. We'll go and get the money somewhere else. I mean, how responsible is that? That's the way it should be.
I completely agree with that, but many African governments are very timid about trying to do something like that. I think the Ethiopians are, in fact, very, very bold and very unique in being able to step up and really demanding that negotiations be conducted between equals, because that's really the stance they're taking. Treat us as an equal partner in these discussions and these negotiations. And the number of delegations that have come out of Africa to China very often still don't include fully functional, as it were, African translators of Chinese to English or Chinese to French. It's gotten a lot better of late. But you've got to have that kind of capacity because, of course, as all of us around this broadcast podcast know, the devil is in the detail and in the small talk in between the main negotiating sessions. If you can't participate in those, well, you're dead in the water, for starters. So upgrading capacity has got, again, as I said before, all kinds of nuances attached to it. And it's basically dealing with those nuances. But just to return to a point that Knosana was making, what you've got in terms of the Chinese government and its party, or the party and its government, basically trying to see the world in its own image and dealing with it as if the world were a mirror of its own image. That's reflected in the way that embassies, Chinese embassies, conduct political reportage and economic reportage in the countries where they're based. They're mandated to talk to the government. They're not mandated to talk to the opposition, for instance. So in 2008, when in a fair election, Morgan Tsvangirai should have been the winner of the presidential elections in Zimbabwe, and I was there for that. All my polling had him out 56%. He was a clear victor in those elections. Knosana is very familiar with those elections.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the Chinese at that point in time, when even their polling suggested that Morgan Tsvangirai was going to be the rightful winner before it was stolen from him, had no file on Tsvangirai to send to Beijing, because they had not been mandated to look at the opposition. It didn't occur to them that the opposition might win a victory. Their commitment was to Robert Mugabe and to this particular party. That's changed a little bit, so that in Zambia they did have a file on Hichilema, the new Zambian president who won decisively their recent elections. But you've got this whole history, this whole backlog of naivety that the world must be as China sees it. And there's one other factor which I would like to introduce as well. That's to do with a certain, almost unconscious value, as it were, approach to what the Chinese are doing. It's part of a self-justification, but it's also something that they truly believe in. Just as the Americans truly believe in spreading the word of democracy, etc., etc. And that is, there's still a very, basically, difficult to describe, but residual Confucianism in the way the Chinese think about the outside world and their obligation to the outside world. The idea of reciprocity, that you have an obligation to those that you're helping, while at the same time you're looting their resources, to use a vulgar term, but you still have to give something back, and a lot back, particularly up front. So you've got this Confucian reciprocity, which is vertical, it's hierarchical, it's not flat line and egalitarian like a Western view of political ethics. But because it's hierarchical, the big brother at the top must look after the younger brother, even if the younger brother owes big brother all kinds of things. But this means that you're treating African countries frequently with an unconscious bias that they're the younger brother. And this actually takes equality out of negotiations. That's why the Ethiopians have been so good at demanding equality, and the Angolans to a certain extent as well. But it's hard for the rest of the world to follow this because, of course, you've got Portuguese as the language of government in Angola. And we're bad enough with Chinese, let alone Portuguese as well. But demanding to be treated as an equal in the face of an unconscious Confucian hierarchical view of the world, and also in the face of what Knosana so ably pointed out, that the world is seen in modern terms as a replica of Chinese governing structures. When you've got those twin biases built into the foundation of the Chinese vision, well, very, very often you're going to have a great difficulty in recognizing the possibility and the desirability of equality in negotiation. Add to that naivety and lack of preparedness and a distinction between technocratic thought and political drivers in many African governments, then you've got almost sometimes the recipe for a perfect storm. But as Knosana was saying, this is not because the Chinese are being wicked. They're being a victim of circumstances in terms of their own formation, as much as the Africans might be a victim of circumstances in their formation today. So this whole thing has got much more delicacy to it than many, I think, casual commentators would be prepared to admit.
Can I just add a slightly different way of looking at this? Often I say to people, we cannot have a conversation about Africa, the Africa-China axis without triangulation. What do I mean by that? China has got very strong relationships with the Western world, because that's really the counter, isn't it? This debate only arises because we are comparing the Western world and the Eastern world to some extent, and then Africa. So let's triangulate. China deals with the US, with Europe. China deals with Africa. Europe and the West deal with Africa. Let's compare how these three axes work. So the evidence on the ground is that the Chinese and the West can deal with each other. In spite of having very different systems, okay? They deal with each other. There are many Western businesses in China, and China is present and trades with the whole world. The Western world has had a very long-lasting relationship with Africa, and a lot of the damage that has happened on the African continent is not because of China. It's been because of the relationship with the Western world. Now, when you look at the amount of capital that is sloshed between these geographies, in fact, what is coming onto the African continent is dwarfed by the amount of money that are moving between China and the Western world. So exactly what is the conversation? China is an appropriate partner for the Western world, trade partner, business partner, political partner. They've got embassies everywhere for the Western world, but not for Africa, really? You begin to see that the logic that is being used to debate this is flawed. Because the reason why the Western world and the China relationship works is because there is an acceptance that each side is responsible for the outcomes for themselves. China is not going to go to the West to try and be nice and make the Western world benefit to the detriment of China, or vice versa. There is that understanding assumed already. So why aren't we asking of Africa the same thing?
So over here, just a quick question for you, Professor Chan. From what Dr. Moyo said, obviously pragmatism is a very practical way of China's political philosophy towards the world as well. So there is no perpetual friends, only eternal interest. I guess it really stands to context. However, I was in Spain for the past 6 weeks teaching, and in looking at the old Spanish Empire, it just really brings to mind this historical understanding of cycles. Well, that's go away and global powers fade. And at one point in time, now it's all good. China is investing tremendously in Africa and bringing economic prosperity to Africa in a profound way as well. However, with this sort of transactional relationship, it's a win-win. Everybody's built on this understanding of economic prosperity. One day when the music chair, when the money stops, then what happens?
Well, it's a big question. What happens when the money stops with any one of us? But things can change quite rapidly. And the worm can turn, to use an old Western phrase. And this almost happened in 2008 with the Western banking crisis. And one of the national casualties, or likely casualties of this, was Portugal. Portugal, as a nation state, was on the verge of going bankrupt. At that stage, curiously, the Angolans, having been a Portuguese colony, and I'm sure they did this with a lot of schadenfreude and emotional satisfaction, and they're also being cheeky, but they really could have done it. They said, we'll bail you out. We've got the capacity to save your economy. And they did have the capacity to save the Portuguese economy. They didn't have to at the end, because finally the West sorted out its own banking crisis. But it shows that things are not set in some kind of perpetual logic or a perpetual predetermined for all time way of doing things. So it'd be interesting to see how Africa does develop. This won't happen immediately, obviously, but there are signs that some African countries are going to become extremely able in terms of how they deal with the outside world. If I could just pick up on Knosana's point about comparing China with the United States, for instance, I was part of what was grandly called a trilateral dialogue in Washington, D.C. once, again, on the side of the African delegation. The trilateral participants were China, an African delegation, which was drawn largely from both the African Union, the Secretariat of the African Union, and African ministers from different parts. China, Africa in that sense, and the Americans. And the Americans were just as blatantly disregarding of the African ambitions as the Chinese were. It was quite horrifying, in fact. And the African delegation one night just locked itself away, literally locked itself away. And we sat down and wrote a declaration about how we would like both sides to treat African aspirations, because they were both as guilty as the other while calling each other names, of course. You're more dirty than us, you're more wicked than us. But both were absolutely condescending to quite a high-powered African delegation. It was led by the deputy chair of the African Union. That's pretty senior in African terms. And everyone around the table, not just an advisor like me, we were just completely disgusted by the condescension from both sides. So the point is, yes, sometimes the Chinese make big mistakes in their assumptions and their condescension, etc. So does the West. And as Knosana was saying, it's we in the West who've done historical damage, far more than what the Chinese have managed to do. And so we need to look to ourselves. In fact, what you're looking at in terms of each side calling the other dirtier than they, you're looking at a common historical phenomenon where the outside world as a whole has condescended towards Africa. It's that which needs to change. And then Africa can develop relations of its own choosing, of its own type, with all parts of the world, not just with China.
And again, if I may, so I can say so as an African here. I think the sad truth is that respect is not something you demand. Respect is something you earn through what you do and how you do what you do. I often say, sadly, the world today, because of political correctness, so you get a seat at the UN, you get a seat be represented at the World Bank, at the IMF and the like. But do you really have a voice? By being present physically, it does not mean you've got a voice. Until you bring quality to the conversations that take place, you don't have a voice. You are present, yes, because you are being human. And this is not something that either China or the West can correct for us. It's up to us to correct it. And we can only do it once we understand capacity and merit matter. The quality of what you do and how you do it matter. And that's the only way. There's never been an exception. In fact, if I may put it very bluntly, the Chinese and the West don't like each other. In fact, there is lots of denigration that goes on between the two of them. But do the Chinese, I was going to use French, excuse me, do they care? The answer is no, they don't care. Why don't they care? Because they can run their country properly. That's why they don't care. And Africa needs to wake up and understand that.
If I could come in very quickly on behalf of our students. I mean, there is also the question of a friend or foe for who exactly. I mean, a closer relationship with China may be advantageous for authoritarian states or those with authoritarian aspirations, but not for democracies. So it's a question of how attractive the Beijing model of governance is for different states, depending on where they are, with big state intervention, centralized political control. But particularly for our students, they're interested in the C word, which is colonialism. And so to be as provocative as the title of the session supposes, I mean, central to questions of African development have been questions of to what extent development itself is an enduring form of colonialism. For better, for worse, the same Western countries of empire are heavily involved in reshaping the economies today, leading humanitarian missions, helping out with conflicts, etc. So as China has some expansionist agenda, at least on the surface, whether that is overplayed or not, in the South China Sea, for example, does the colonialism question hold water in this context, even if it's non-military and only economic?
So if I may, Lawrence, can I call you Lawrence? Is that okay? So my question, I think your question is absolutely valid and your students are right to ask those questions. So first question is, what has Africa learned from its history of being colonized? What is the evidence today that we've actually extracted value from the journey traveled that we are now applying to avoid any repeats? And the second question I would ask your students is, who is colonizing Africa? Is it China or Africans inviting China to colonize them? Agency again. Where are you putting the responsibility? Do Chinese issue themselves passport, African visas and residence permits and so on and so on? No, they don't. We do it.
Yes.
If we keep pointing fingers at over there rather than examining what we are doing wrong, we will never solve this. The minute we take responsibility and introspect about what we do and why we do it, things we shouldn't continue doing, we're not going to solve the problem. It is our responsibility.
No, I agree absolutely with that. And the very use of the term colonialism tends to be very, very lazy. It assumes that Africa is just open for being colonized again, as if the African subject had no agency to resist or negotiate or fight back against this. It's really a recycling underneath progressive colors of the most lazy colonial trope that you can walk into Africa and do what you like. So although I also understand why the students say that, and I'm from SOAS, I can say this to LSE students, you have to complicate your analysis a little bit. The world is not quite as straightforward that simply it can be diagnosed just like that with a single sort of word drawn from the past. relationships are very, very complicated, and they need to be treated as very, very complicated. And what Knosana was saying, the future lies in Africa, and everyone else for that matter, developing its own agency. But to assume that there's an insufficiency of agency and to use words like a rerun of colonialism, that's not the way to appreciate a very, very complex and emerging continent. And emerging means what it says. That word, at least, is a real word. There's so much progress being made, very problematically, underneath very, very complicated and complex and contradictory colors. But there's an awful lot of, let us say, Afro-optimism that is possible alongside the obvious Afro-pessimism, which you just can't wish away. But you've got a picture emerging of a dynamic continent and not one just open, prostrate on the ground for the penetration of a new colonialism.
I mean, one example, I think, again, we write lots of plans and pieces of paper and what have you. But, you know, the economic integration of Africa is such an obvious thing to do. This should have happened years ago. And you, as an African, you have to ask yourself, what is it that is all? Why don't we realize that without an integrated African economy, we are not going anywhere? The way the world works is through contestation. Even if you look again, I use examples of Europe and the US. These are the same people. They are forever taking each other to court to the World Trade Organization on trade issues and so on. Contestation right through and through. So we need to understand that everybody has got the legitimacy of looking after their interests. And it is up to us to strengthen ourselves. And we talk about Africa. Africa is comparable to India in terms of size of population. The economy is kind of not in the same, but if we created an African economy, not 54 economies, would begin to have economies of scale, which would allow us both, in fact, to attract investments much more easily, because if an investor says, I come and invest in little Malawi, but I've got the whole continent as a market without hindrance and so on and so on, capital is going to come in. Why don't we see these things? Why don't we understand them? Who is to blame other than us? Who is to blame?
So
It's
we
us.
do hear a very strong. We do hear a very strong sense of the rise of that African continental identity. And in a way, it's similar, I guess, to the rise of nationalism that we see in China, and even today, very much so in the United States. But with that sense of that ownership of Africa by the African leaders, particularly with China's in Africa. So this morning, talking about all these documentaries.
Sorry, Shirley, I lost you.
So this morning, talking about all. I'm back now.
Yeah.
So this morning, talking about the African aspirations, we did hear a lot of aspirations for Africa, and very ambitious aspirations, including from you, Dr. Moyo. We heard this morning from the African Development Bank that Africa wants to catch up from a low income status to a high income status like China within one generation. Africa wants to lead the fourth wave of industrial revolutions. And this morning, Hannah, on your panel, she talked about Africa as a continent would become the world's third largest economy. And I think that'll happen. It's just a matter of time.
So
but then let's think about it.
Let me ask you a question. I'm going to ask a question which I'm not going to answer, but I'll put it out there. Of the African leaders,
Professor Chen.
okay, of the African leaders at head of state level, as of today, how many do you think have got a clue of what we're talking about and what to do about it? Just, I leave that. I didn't. There are a few, but not many. So the technocrats can write all the papers they like. The implementation is going to come from political will. And as Professor Chan indicated, in the case of President Lungu and Margaret Mwanakato, who I know very well, these contradictions where the capacity is there at lower level. The technical ability is there. In fact, we educate people and export them because we don't want to use them, because we prefer to give jobs to people who don't know anything that they're doing because of patronage. Look at, the concept, for instance, of privatization or no privatization. It's got nothing to do with ideology, in my opinion. You can run public sector institutions quite competently, provided you man them with competent people. But what do? We use the fact that these are public sector institutions to put our relatives in charge of them. Relatives who know nothing about how to run them. And then you can look at the evidence right across the continent. Look at all the public sector institutions and what has become of them. How did we get there? If you go to Europe, there are certain public sector institutions like railways, which up to today running efficiently. So it's not private public sector which is the issue. It's understanding you need competency to run these things. Give the right people the jobs to run them. It's like when you go to the doctor, you want to be operated by your cousin who has never been to medical school. Really? You don't do that. So why do you do it with these things?
I must give Professor Chan some fair airtime here. So just to follow up on what Knosana just talked about. So let's say Africa gets there with AFCFTA, becomes the world's third largest economy, according to Hannah, by the midpoint of the century. And China will be the world's largest economy, and possibly Africa will be China's largest investment market. And then you are looking at possibly with our RCEP, with ASEAN, then China, ASEAN, and Africa integration is solidly there, and China is all in on ASEAN and Africa. What opportunities is there still left for the West?
Well, I think this is something the West has got to face up to, that they could only be one player among many players of huge capacity, economic capacity, and huge sophistication. And I really do hope that Africa is one of those new players, and it's got every possibility of being so if it gets its act together along the lines that Knosana was talking about. But again, as Knosana was saying, it's got to overcome many problems. My own favorite example of giving, as it were, a very complicated job to someone who's close to you, but in a slightly different way than mere family, was Jacob Zuma and the chief executive of South African Airways. The relationship there is quite well known, the stuff of gossip, but how not to run an airline, how to ruin an airline, emerging from bankruptcy now, having lost 40 of its 46 planes. And really, it's almost a prime example of how not to do something. Whereas again, if I can labor my example of the Ethiopians, Ethiopian Airways is the perfect example of how to run a professional airline. You run it professionally. So if Africa can integrate its economies far more, and if it can appoint technocratic people without political interference into strategic sectors, yes, it can be one of the great players along China, alongside ASEAN. Basically, and I still have some hope for the future of Europe as a bloc player, although it seems to be going out of its way to disappoint me at this moment in time. All of these things are possible, but it won't just be the West as represented by the United States of America. It's going to be a much more complex array of players, of differing, but at the same time, at the end of the day, something like equal throw weight, but arrived at in different ways. So that the bipolar world that we see now, just America and China, isn't going to be the case in the future. And of course, it's my hope, it's Knosana's hope, it's all of our hope that Africa will be up there as one of the big players. But it does have to make some great internal steps forward along the lines of what we've been discussing in this debate or discussion today. It can do that. If the new generation of technocratically capable people replace the dead weight, and I do refer to them as dead weight, of old presidents who know nothing about the world and its complexities, if there could be that kind of sea change in terms of leadership, then there's everything to play for a very, very different future.
In fact, Steve, the base is so low that great strides can be made so quickly, you would be amazed. It's not complicated. Africa is endowed with, in terms of resources, unimaginable in relative terms. And even human resources, which we just choose not to use. So the hurdle is so low, the opportunity is so big, the resource base so big that it would be, would make wonders very, very quickly. And I hope that, Lawrence, you can give your students some of this advice that they need to take responsibility.
I was going to say it's truly lucky and fortunate that China has been having the right kind of leadership that brought China to this economic miracle. We only need 55 times of that sort of right leadership in Africa, which is very easy. Dr. Moyo, it's we've got I can see the work that we need to do ahead. Sorry, Lawrence, go ahead, please.
Oh, we have another question coming from Tapua Gomo, who asks for Dr. Moyo to comment on Rwanda. So why is Rwanda doing better than other African leaders? And how does that fit within the scope of China's role in Africa? I suppose the question is asking what lessons could be learned, perhaps.
The lesson is, it's again, President Kagame. Firstly, let me maybe give you a bit of history, which I happen to have an insight on because I had the privilege of being able to access President Kagame when I was at the ADB. And the President Kagame was very close to Prime Minister Meles. They were counterparts before Meles died. And they used to have very close conversations about what to do. So don't be surprised that we are talking on the one hand about what happens in Ethiopia and what the Ethiopians have done and what Kagame is doing, because they were of very similar minds in terms of taking ownership of what they were going to do with their country. Whoever is asking the question, I hope they are aware of the Gachacha issue. Remember, after the genocide, the Western world wanted the people who were perpetrators of this crime to be tried in The Hague, and Kagame said no. We are going to use what am I illustrating? Ownership, agency. He said, no, I know my own community, I know my country, I know my society, and the appropriate solution is we are going to use our own traditional legal systems to deal with this issue. And that's what he did. He had the confidence, but what you can see in terms of what Kagame has done is that above all else, he's got the interests of his country and his people. And he believes in getting competent people to run things. I don't know whether you've been to Kigali. If you're not been, you should go and see how Rwanda as a country, what it has managed to achieve in the last 20 years post the genocide. Amazing stuff, and it's illustrative of what all the other African countries could achieve. So it's just political will, respect for meritocracy, and a clarity in terms of agency, and not trying to give that responsibility to somebody else. I think those are the things that are required.
I think one other thing too, which fits into the theme of our discussion, a respect for technocracy. So if you were to ask Kagame's people, what's his external role model? He's going to say Singapore.
Absolutely.
Another country that has developed, a small country like Rwanda, has developed because of technical skill. And there's been no bones made about that. Singapore set out to do that. Kagame wanted to use that as his role model. He wanted Kigali to be the wired-up capital of East Africa along Singaporean lines. Now, it takes an awful lot of educated skill to even appreciate that you can use the example of Singapore. It's looking east, but in a different way, to almost a paradigm of what could happen in Asia as a whole to benefit China, for instance, if it wanted to look at the Singaporean model of the blend between public and private sector, letting some liberties go forth on a commercial basis. So Kagame, had the wisdom, the foresight, and I do absolutely credit his discussions with Meles Zenawi. These were two men of very rare foresight. And if they were helping out each other, and if they were looking east to an unusual part of the East, that is Singapore, not looking to Beijing or Shanghai, That shows real perception as well as imagination. So all of those things that you mentioned, but also an appreciation of the absolute indispensability of having a technocratic future. The world is different now to the world of liberation. You can't have an imagination of the past. And if your imagination of the future can't understand these complex things, then to put it point blank, you have got no right to be president of your country anymore.
Agreed.
That is indeed so interesting. So Professor Chen and actually Knosana Chu, you both are actually talking about the Africa's exploration of a hybrid, almost a hybrid kind of technocratic governance model that is neither east nor west. So essentially, this morning somebody was talking about, in the opening session, we were talking about Africa adopting the state industrial policies in Africa in terms of promoting technological diffusion. And I just thought, that's something very innovative. Is that appropriate in the African continent within the broader context? Do you think Africa will essentially adopt an industrial policy model?
I see no reason why not. I mean, private entrepreneurs, in fact, these are from the informal sector in Nigeria, developed a tablet, a laptop tablet, that could be manufactured with the same capacity as a Western or a Huawei tablet for $10. The Indians have done the same. Now, just think about what this can do. We're all still busily sending used school books and university textbooks by the cargo load to African universities and to African schools. That's so old-fashioned on our part. If we sent tablets where one child can access several thousand books and have them manufactured for $10 each using African expertise, supporting African startups to do exactly that, you would cut through the education gap like a knife cuts through butter. So it's imagination and it's supporting local entrepreneurs who've got the skills to do this. So yes, of course, Africa should industrialize. And by that, I mean a generation jump in an industry. It doesn't have to be heavy polluting industry. You can go straight to the technological electronic stuff. And if you say they can't do that, they bloody well can do that. Trust people, invest in the startups, trust the young people. They can work it out. This amazing skill that is just untapped by patronage societies that are also technologically illiterate. Once you cut through that, the future is bright, but it means entrusting technology, technocratic skills, and above all, the younger generation. Let the younger generation have its head, young men and young women, and what you're going to have is the kind of revolution that Knosana has been dreaming of and which I certainly hope for.
In fact, Steve, your point is so important. In the morning, there was a conversation about the environmental issues and moving away from fossil fuels into renewable energy. And what I pointed out is that these are situations where, in fact, underdevelopment is an asset. It's an asset because you don't have baggage, which is quite costly to convert in order for you to make the transition. It's almost like you're starting from scratch anyway. There is nothing to lose. So you can cast off the light vest you are wearing because you don't have a shirt and a jacket, and you know what I mean, and move on very quickly. And it's just a mindset issue. We need to understand this is where it could be a huge advantage. We don't have this weighing us down in terms of the cost of jettisoning what we already have because it's very little.
Mm-hmm. And one last question, perhaps a sensitive one. In recent months, there was a terrorist attack in Pakistan of 9 Chinese engineers in a bus attack, as a matter of fact. And so right afterwards, China's party newspaper, Global Times, they came up with an op-ed in which it says that China wouldn't mind sending special operational forces into Pakistan to help eradicate terrorism. And so honestly, this would be my first experience in hearing that China is actually willing to deploy special forces beyond its border to essentially protect its overseas interests, either human or assets. So with massive amount of investment interests growing in Africa and beyond, do you foresee in the coming decades that there will be an increasing military presence or security presence from China on the African continent?
This is a very tough one and a very sensitive one, of course. If there is going to be such a thing, they better upgrade the capacity of their soldiers. I've seen Chinese peacekeeping soldiers in African jurisdictions who I would regard as completely hopeless. They don't know what they're doing. They've got no command structure that is viable for the task at hand. Their job is just to sit there and be symbolic and let other peacekeeping forces do all the heavy lifting. And African forces are quite good at peacekeeping. They could quite do without any kind of interference from well-meaning outside forces. In terms of special units to guard sensitive installations, well, the Americans have been doing this for quite some time, but disguising it underneath private contractor arrangements. That's not part of the Chinese model, but I would advise very strongly against any kind of direct Chinese military official presence. It sends all the wrong signals, and it discourages, in this case, the Pakistanis from dealing with dissent and dissatisfaction in their own country. The Belt and the Road initiative, insofar as the overland route, the physical overland route, and the maritime route were going to be joined up, had to go through Pakistan. The three Chinese railheads to go from China through Pakistan, one of them went through Baluchistan, the most troubled part of Pakistan, with an insurgency problem right on the border with Afghanistan. So there was cross-border theft there. None of the Chinese planning documents seem to recognize that this would be problematic. And so now to say, because we had no political intelligence, because we were naive and stupid about this, therefore let's send in special forces, that's very rich. It shows naivety on the Chinese part as well. And it's not going to be cleaned up by sending in special forces who may have no sensitivity to the needs of the local population, not understand the real causes of the Baluchistani insurgency, have no understanding of the cross-border traffic between Baluchistan and Afghanistan, or deals with central Taliban leaderships notwithstanding, which the Chinese are trying to forge right now. That is a hugely difficult environment. And trying to send in commando forces, aggressive, as it were, peacemaking forces to parts of Africa, you're asking for trouble. You've got to understand the local situation. And if you're going to do it, you better send in damn sight higher caliber soldiers than what the Chinese have done so far in African peacekeeping missions.
I agree with that. I second that, and I think firstly, I think the issue of peace is a global issue, not a Pakistani, Chinese, or whatever. I think we should have learned lessons from the past. That peace is a global issue. Therefore, the structure of intervention, I think, ought to take guidance from that observation. So if you're dealing with a situation which is an in-country situation, I think the best way is to support the local resources for them to be at the front of that intervention. If it's a regional issue, again, use, in the first instance, regional resources, support those to deliver that. As Professor Chan says, they understand the environment, they understand the societies, and it's the best way to do it. And then if we escalate beyond that, we have to try harder, in my opinion, to find ways of using the UN and make it a real functional thing. We need to understand a much more nuanced global approach to achieve global peace, and then not say China is going out of its territory to protect its interests. I think that's looking for trouble.
Well, with that, we would love to thank both gentlemen, Professor Stephen Chen Foundation Dean of SOAS, University of London, and Chair Professor of World Politics, Dr. Knosana Moyo, politician and economist from Zimbabwe. We thank you so much for your insightful views on China's future role in the African continent. And I would like to thank all our audience who have been with us all day. Please do continue to stay with us, sending your comments, your questions, and we'll continue to deliver high-quality China-Africa programs with our global talent.